Before we get into this week's episode of Last Orders, I just want to let you all know about two very special events that are coming up. On Friday, the 11th of April, I'm speaking at a Free Speech Union event in Belfast, all about the speech police. I'll be there with Harry Miller, Jenny Holland, talking about this disturbing new trend of the police showing up at your door if you criticise your child's school too vigorously. A couple of days later, on Tuesday, the 15th of April, we've got a very special Spike Supporters online event. Brendan O'Neill will be having a live edition of his podcast, The Brendan O'Neill Show, and he'll be joined by the great Julia Hartley-Brewer. If you want to come along to this, if you want to sit in on the Zoom event and ask them your questions, you need to be a Spike supporter. So to get your tickets, if you are a supporter, or to become a supporter, to get your ticket, go to spiked-online.com/supporters. Now, on with the show.
Sort of displayed their naked bias against people who are in grubby things like trade. How awful.
They're so nice. I don't know if we're even allowed to say this.
Yeah.
I mean,
does this qualify as an advert? Yeah.
A society that has more and more regulation and restrictions, I don't think is fundamentally a very happy one.
Hello and welcome back to Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater, editor of Spiked, joined as I am in every episode by Chris Snowdon from the IA. How you doing, Chris?
Hi, Tom. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. And also very good to see our very special guest, Luke Johnson, the eminent businessman and commentator. How are you doing, Luke?
I'm good, thanks.
It's great to have you here, not least because we're talking about one of the many sectors that you're very involved in, the pub trade. Chris, there's been some latest statistics about the kind of rate of closures. It always looks like a bleak picture, but it looks particularly bleak this year. Is that fair to say? Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what's been going on there?
Yeah, I mean, as long as I can remember, we've been hearing about huge numbers of pubs closing every week, month or year. And, you know, we have seen this massive collapse in the number of pubs. There's just no two ways about it. And a few bars open up here or there, but it doesn't come anywhere near making up for the lost pubs. And so we've got a projection, what is it, 500 pubs or something? I can't remember what the exact figure is. It's certainly hundreds of pubs are expected to go out of business. I'm sure they will. They do every year. The main pressures, and Luke's obviously the expert here, but the main pressures are, I guess, are the minimum wage hike, the national insurance hike, and continued, well, bad kind of trading, as they call it. You know, I mean, people are not feeling very wealthy at the moment. The cost of living crisis, insofar as inflation has kind of died down, but yeah, people's wages are still catching up with that. But let's head over to Luke. What do you think?
Well, as you say, Christopher, I think the sort of decline of the public house in the UK has gone on for many years. Unquestionably, in my opinion, it's accelerated partly because of lockdowns. I think they were a catastrophe for the sector. Because I think an awful lot of people got out of the habit of going out for a drink. And there's been quite a lot written about this recently. I also think it's deeper than that. I think that quite a lot of people got out of the habit of socialising, which is very worrying, not just on an economic level, but on a psychological, cultural level. And, you know, the public house has been the cornerstone of meeting places in villages and towns for hundreds and hundreds of years. And, you know, to a degree, all the generations will mix and converse in a pub. And if through taxation and the circumstance of the economy, the business model essentially breaks down, and, you know, from many places across the country, the pub completely disappears, we will severely miss them when they're gone. And it will be a tragedy for our history and our culture and everything else, and I think our civilization.
Mm-hmm.
I think pubs really matter. They're not just beer shops. They are a great deal more than that. And they're actually one of the things, for example, when tourists come to this country, they always want to go to pubs, you know, and our pubs are famous and they're really important, I think. And we still have 50,000 of them. So it's not like the industry's dead. And it's still a huge industry, probably worth 20 billion a year, employing hundreds of thousands of people. But it is under, I think, unprecedented pressure. I would think at least half pubs barely make a profit at all. And so they're not able to invest. A lot of them have a hangover of debt from the lockdowns and so forth that they're struggling under. dare I say it, quite a lot of pubs have not invested in their fabric, and they're not open as much as they used to. Quite a lot of pubs now shut on a Monday and Tuesday evenings.
Or shut early as well.
Shut early. And, this is slightly feels like a spiral of decline. And it's tough to know what to do. But as you, Christopher, have pointed out very regularly, the tax on alcohol, the business rates, VAT, corporation tax, national insurance, PAYE, of course, upped national living wage, it's a brutal burden. And very few other segments of society are as heavily taxed as pubs. And, at the end of the day, going to a pub is a discretionary choice. God forbid you can always go to a big supermarket and buy a 4-pack and go and drink at home in front of the telly.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, that's not real life. Real life is going and meeting other people, after work or of a weekend or at lunchtime or wherever, and sharing a glass of something, maybe not even alcoholic, but and eating and whatever, and debating and having a joke, banter, laugh, and making friends, meeting strangers. This is what life's about. And if you kill the space where they go because you make it completely uneconomic, then you won't get it back.
And I was wondering about this, Chris, because one thing that we talk about a lot on the show is how various kind of measures backfire. Various kind of nanny state measures, the kind of rise in alcohol
Unintended
related
consequences.
Absolutely, the law of unintended
consequences.
exactly. But that should be another segment on this show, the law of unintended consequences. But is there also there's potential for a kind of public health knock on to if more and more pubs continue to close? There has been this shift towards people post lockdown just kind of taking their 4-pack home with them rather than actually drinking in a pub. Orwell was obviously a great source of quotes on many things, but also pub says that the big mistake temperance lobbyists made was that they thought that people go to pubs to get drunk. Obviously that's part of it, but it also has all these other social benefits. But like a world in which people tend to just be kind of drinking on their own rather than around other people, it's surely not going to be good for the amount people are drinking and also their general well-being, to use that irritating
No, well,
phrase.
it's certainly how much they drink is really up to them. But no, it's not good for their well-being. But you've got to see it from their point of view. In London, a pint of beer can easily cost £7.50. And even outside London, regularly £6 or more these days. And everyone knows what it costs in the supermarket. The solution is not, as some people in the pub trade, to whack up the price of supermarket drink. There's always going to be a significant differential between supermarket beer and pub beer. People have traditionally been quite happy to pay the pub prices because obviously you're getting a lot more than the alcohol, right? You're getting the service and the company and the Sky Sports and the your glasses washed up and all the rest of it. They're two completely different things. But who can really afford £6-7 a pint? Who can afford 20 quid for a bottle of wine that full well you can buy yourself for £8 or £9? So you have to see it from the punter's perspective. I think the government is to blame. In all sorts of ways, for going from the smoking ban right up to the business rates and everything else. But I notice a lot, not so much in London, but elsewhere, the pubs, so some of them still doing pretty well, but it's a lot of old people, middle-aged old people. You don't see that many young people in pubs anymore. And that's just got to be the price, I think, hasn't it? Primarily. We're pricing people out, and will they get into the habit of going to pubs in later life? I don't know.
The stats I've seen say it isn't just that, actually. It's also they're drinking less.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
There is no doubt that behaviours, and there are structural changes there going on. Maybe that's also price, and it's obviously by no means all young people, but particularly amongst women for health and other reasons, they've decided not to drink alcohol. So habits are changing, but I think the sort of health threat of things like loneliness, which is what it is basically if you're boozing at home by yourself, are very real. And, meeting other people in person, not, looking at your screen, is, to me, the basis of being, human and a social animal, which we are. And I think that one of the many terrible legacies of lockdowns was to decapitate that for an extended period of time, and habits changed. And I think it's been very bad for society.
And also, one of the few decent things the government did to try and mitigate that damage to pubs during lockdown was to allow pubs to sell booze for you to take off the premises, which I've never really understood why there's a law against that in the first place. But they did generously allow pubs to, sell you an actual pint, and you could take it home with you or what have you, or drink it in the park on your own. But this week, the government just got rid of that. Now, I'm not saying this is a deal breaker for whether a pub keeps going or not. But why would you even bother? Why don't you just go, well, that law was never needed in the first place. We won't go to any effort to get rid of it or bring it back. Yeah, it's just spiteful. So much, I've said this many times, maybe not on the podcast, but, so much of political behaviour can be only understood if you have the conspiracy theory that they're trying to close down all the pubs. You start looking at what they're doing.
Yeah.
Politicians really want to do two things. They want to censor the internet and close the pubs.
Yep.
And most
to everything.
activity by parliamentarians can be explained by that.
Yes,
They'd certainly get less trouble if the pubs
I
were
don't
closed,
quite buy that
for them.
argument, but I happened to be unusually at some sort of event or other the other day in the House of Commons, and it was about the 300-page employment rights bill. And this is the government that say they want growth at all costs. This is their single priority. We have to have growth. Well, if there's as an entrepreneur and businessman of 40 years plus, I can tell you now, one way to definitely reduce growth is to introduce a new burden of a 300-page employment rights bill, because a very large proportion of all the companies in this country are very small. They can't afford an HR department. They haven't even got an HR officer. And when I went to speak at the select committee about this, they questioned me about, had I read the 300-page bill, as if real people have got time to do that. And, surely businesses can adapt. And it's quite obvious that quite a lot of people, I would say, in Parliament, civil servants, ministers, MPs, but particularly among this government who've passed this law, never meet people who run their own business. They have no idea of the regulation and the red tape that suffocates companies and that eventually just discourages people from continuing to run a business or starting a business. And it is no coincidence that the numbers of companies for the first time in modern history is down. The number of startups for the first time, more or less since modern records began, is down. And I worry, honestly, that entrepreneurs are becoming a somewhat endangered species under this government who say growth is their priority. It's a farce.
Yeah, who'd set up a business in Britain? There's just way too much hassle.
And if we're talking, Luke, specifically about the pub trade, if you were Chancellor, if you were able to repeal some things or introduce some other things, what do you think would be most helpful for the pub trade at the moment now that it's kind of on its knees?
An awful lot of other European countries do, and have a reduced rate of VAT on food and drink sales out of home. France, Ireland, many other countries across Europe have it. The rates vary from 5 to 10%. The fact is food in the supermarkets is VAT-free. And, why are restaurants and pubs and cafes forced to pay 20% VAT on everything they sell?
Can I ask you a question before we leave this topic? This is a question I asked you at Spike's 25th, and you're the first person to give me a decent answer to it, because it's a question I've been asking lots of people over the years. And the basic question is this. When I'm in London, which is usually in Westminster or central London, the pubs, generally speaking, are extremely busy, certainly Monday to Thursdays. I mean, very, very busy, as in they cannot sell the beer fast enough. You've got people queuing up, you've got people stood outside in their dozens on the pavement, drinking away, and they're selling the beer at £7 to £8 a pint. And if you go to all sorts of places in the rest of the country, I go back to North Yorkshire, a pint is £3. Now, I understand that in London there's higher wages. I understand that the rents might be higher if you're renting the pub, but I've never understood until you told me. If you own your own pub, you're an independent publican. You have the pub in your family for generations. That takes out the rent issue. So all you're doing is having to pay your staff a couple of quid an hour more, and they are bringing in 20 quid every minute, pretty much. So how can it be necessary to charging £7.50 a pint in London?
Well, I would say that outside of cities, an awful lot of pubs are owned freehold, So yes, you're right. The rent isn't an issue, although business rates will still be an issue. But in cities, particularly London, the vast majority of the pubs will not be owned freehold. They will be rented from commercial landlords who charge, rents that, I don't know, if you go to a small town in North Yorkshire as opposed to Westminster, the rent might well be 5 to 10 times as much per square foot.
Right.
And the rates commensurately higher too. Probably the rates bill for a London pub will be very significantly higher than the entire occupancy cost out in the provinces. Wages is not going to be the issue. And obviously your buying costs for things like utilities or beer or food or whatever would be the same. But the fact is your occupancy costs are massively higher. Having said that, I would say yes, pubs in busy central London locations still make good money. And so, they, in a way, are less threatened. I think it's more village pubs with, quiet footfall outside, locals that are serving communities that are under financial pressure, where the difference between buying the beer or the wine at a supermarket and a pub is, for them, significant. So inevitably they go for the cheaper option because going to the pub is very expensive. People in London earn lots more money, so they can, in general, afford to go out more, and that's part of the reason they come to London, of course.
Especially in Westminster, when most of them are putting on expenses, probably.
Yes,
Or
or they're paid by the taxpayer.
Exactly. Yeah.
Absolutely. So moving from alcohol and pubs
Before
to
we move
smoking.
from alcohol, can I get a top up?
Yeah, we can have a little. We'll have a little break. We'll have something come up. We'll be back in one moment. So now that Chris is topped up, Chris, shall we talk about smoking? What's been going on in the anti-smoking world recently?
Yep, always lots going on, Tom, in the anti-smoking world. The anti-smoking lobby, by which I basically mean ASH, the tiny pressure group funded by the government
They're
to
very
lobby the
successful.
government.
Pound for pound, they're doing very well.
Unbelievably successful. Fantastic use of Department of Health money. They haven't even waited for the tobacco and vapes bill to hit the Lords before issuing their new set of demands. So tobacco and vapes bill, which is going to introduce tobacco prohibition over a period of many decades, and also interfere with vapors and ban various different things. We've talked about it on the show before, don't need to go into that. That flew through the House of Commons, went through its third reading last week. So now it's going to the House of Lords. And so ASH's APPG, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Smoking, which ASH literally set up in the 1970s and is a secretariat for, and it's basically just a front group for ASH. They issued a whole load of new things that need to be done. Apparently, the tobacco and vapes bill doesn't go far enough. This globally unprecedented prohibition of tobacco is insufficient to meet the government's targets of going smoke-free by 2030, which, to be fair, it almost certainly is. So what they want to have individual warnings on cigarettes, which Australia has just last month brought in. So the filters have a little warning saying smoking is bad for your health and stuff.
I feel like you've got
just in case people
the
hadn't noticed.
smoker had forgotten.
yeah.
Hadn't noticed.
In between buying and opening the pack.
Yep.
Just a little reminder. So
Do
what
you
else?
you can't be reminded too often, can you?
No, absolutely.
They want to have a great big levy on the tobacco industry, which is the main thing Ash been going on about for years, because it's now just a racket. The old thing about every great cause becomes a business and then becomes a racket. They've won. I mean, they made themselves obsolete, really, right? This tobacco vapes bill should be the end of Ash. The war is really over. But no, it's now just a straightforward grift. So they want, in addition to the many, many billions of pounds that smokers pay in tobacco duty, they want a tax on the tobacco industry, which obviously will be ultimately paid by consumers. And they want to ban cigarette filters, which is a kind of a new one from Ash in the UK. It is an idea that's been floating around the global tobacco control movement for a while. It's never happened, but that's not to say that Britain can't be a world leader and a pioneer as it is in so many other ways. So the idea is that, well, firstly, how are they going to put these warnings on the filters if they ban filters? So there's a bit of a contradiction there, but anyway, never mind. Maybe they just write them down the actual, on the paper. But they say that cigarette filters don't do any good whatsoever and that they're a fraud. and that they give smokers a false sense of security, that they're not going to get smoking-related disease because they have a cigarette with a filter on it. So we need to ban the filters, and then they won't feel that way, and then they'll stop smoking.
So this is a bit like when New Zealand were talking about taking the nicotine out. They think, how can we just make sure they're just mainlining just the tar and not getting anything else?
It's harm maximisation. Yeah. Exactly right. Yeah.
Got you. Okay.
Yeah. No, the whole approach now is harm maximisation. Let's clamp down on vapes and anything else.
So stop loads of people smoking and then kill the remaining smokers as quickly as possible. Yeah. That's kind of how they're doing it. Got you. Okay.
Now, there's so much to say about this because it's such a ridiculous idea. Firstly, there is actually loads of evidence that filters do work. Nobody wants to admit it anymore because we have to lie to ourselves and to our children about all sorts of things in order to discourage them from smoking. But if you look at the evidence going back many, many decades, the filters do seem to have a significant effect. Obviously, they don't make cigarettes anything like safe, but they are safer than smoking a pure, unfiltered, very high tar cigarette. And in a way, governments know this because they actually legislate to have tar yields limited. Right? So the EU clamped down on this. 1992, it reduced the tar yield to 15 milligrams. Then in 2003, it reduced it to 10. I noticed at the time that cigarettes didn't taste as good at that point, but I didn't realise it was EU regulation. And so there's a kind of at least a tacit understanding amongst governments that actually high tar cigarettes are worse for you than low tar cigarettes. And in order to have a low tar cigarette, in practice, you need to have a filter. Now, it's not clear to me whether banning cigarette filters would actually effectively ban cigarettes entirely, because if we're still implementing these tar yield laws, are we not just making it impossible for the tobacco industry to sell a cigarette that? So
do you think it's a Trojan horse? Almost?
I'm not sure because unfiltered cigarettes are still available in some parts of Europe. So I need to get to the bottom of that one. But the bottom line is filters do make cigarettes a bit safer, and banning them is very unlikely to stop existing smokers from stopping, or indeed from people who are inclined to smoke from taking it up, because, believe it or not, smokers are not that health conscious to start with. I don't think it's going to be a deal breaker for them whether they think the cigarette filter reduces their risk of lung cancer by 15% or whatever. And the other thing is that I don't know if you've ever even had an unfiltered cigarette, like a manufactured one, as opposed to a rolling. They are miles better than filtered cigarettes, especially since the EU capped tar yields.
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, you don't know smoking until you've had a proper unfiltered Lucky Strike or a Camel or something like that. I used to pick them up in Switzerland when I could, and they were just a delight, an absolute delight. They are so nice. I don't know if we're even allowed to say this.
Yeah, I mean, does this qualify as an advert? Yeah. If we bleep the brand names, it's probably in the abstract. They're very nice.
But, yeah, they are toasted. Genuinely, they're great, and most people haven't even ever tried one. And I think we don't know what the latent demand is actually for what I would call real cigarettes, which are, let's face it, that's what people smoked when smoking rates were unbelievably high, right? So it's not like it puts people off smoking. I suspect that it would get more people smoking.
What are smoking rates these days?
Pretty low, about 13%.
Yes, and they used to be 50%, didn't they?
Yes, overall, but for men it was like 80%.
Used to be a proper country.
Women now smoke more than men, don't they?
About
young people.
About the same, I think.
Is it? Yeah. I thought.
Might be slightly higher.
So what do you make of this harm maximisation strategy then, Luke?
Well, clearly that's not the intent. I think the point that Christopher makes, which he does frequently better than anyone else, is that the various sort of prohibition lobbies across things like alcohol and cigarettes and other human activities are, I don't know why, but they're sort of obsessed with bossing us around and stopping us doing things and people having fun and passing more laws. And I suppose, going back to the employment rights bill, politicians and a lot of people in and around Westminster go into the game because they love to pass laws and regulations. It's what excites them. They feel that they are doing good. And what they've lost is a conception of, human freedom and what a liberal society means. And as you said, all these laws, or not, most of them have unintended consequences. A lot of them, not good and occasionally worse than the thing they're designed to deal with. And a society that has more and more regulation and restrictions I don't think is fundamentally a very happy one. And they virtually never scrap laws. So, there's just ever more things that are controlled and restricted and forbidden and all the rest of it. And I don't think it's an improvement.
Mm-hmm. Far from it. It leads to just gradual national decline, in my opinion. And historically, the only thing that's changed that is having a war or a revolution every now and again. Maybe the nearest thing we've had to that in peacetime is sort of Margaret Thatcher and Reagan coming in and really shaking things up. But it's very rare you get politicians who come into office to actually make people freer and to deregulate. But that is what I think we need, because this current lot of all colours are hopeless. And yeah, of course, if you're a lawmaker, you're going to, well, that's my job to make laws, isn't it?
Yes.
And Mary Foy, I think she's called, she's on this all-party parliamentary group. And her quote in this press release on smoking was, the only people who benefit from smoking are the tobacco industry. Now, how can you deal with someone with that kind of mentality?
Mm-hmm.
It's the idea, and it's across the board, this is not just the tobacco, it's any industry, the idea that the only people who benefit from mutual exchange as a person selling the product is an incredibly pernicious and stupid and dangerous idea, but it's very widely held.
But I think it comes back to the point I made earlier, that an awful lot of politicians and indeed civil servants and others who create these laws, because I think an awful lot of them are actually generated by the civil servants as much as anything, don't ever meet people who run companies or are in business. And so they don't realise how the economy actually functions. Yeah. And they think there's, free money, that tax can be infinite, and that all that matters, and the BBC and places like that reinforce this, is the public sector, and everything else is secondary. And one of the other horrible aspects of lockdowns was when they prioritised public sector workers. Would you remember that?
Key workers.
Yes, key workers.
They got a lot of privileges.
What a horrible phrase. It's just all wrong.
That was incredible, that key workers.
It sort of displayed their naked bias against people who are in grubby things like trade. How awful. The 6 million public sector are all that matters, and everyone else works for them.
Yeah.
The wrong way round.
Yeah, and it wasn't just doctors and nurses either. It was just anybody who works.
The public sector. Yeah, some pen pushing civil servant.
Well, exactly.
Wales,
my wife kind of was a pen pushing type of public sector person at the time. And do you remember there was a sort of petrol shortage? Quite a severe petrol shortage, or a panic, really.
There was a panic. It was a brief thing.
Yeah. Queues outside the petrol stations.
People were queuing up for petrol. She was queuing up for petrol. Someone was going along. Going like, are you a key worker? You can go on through.
There you go.
And then, it's not that wasn't enough. She was in a pub having a meal with somebody.
And everyone just applauded as soon as she walked in.
At the end of the meal, this isn't a normal pub, right? Not some public sector canteen or something. It's a normal private sector pub. The guy comes over and goes, I review key workers. They just go, it's 20% off.
Brainwashing, I'm afraid.
A higher tier of citizens.
Well, my wife spent most of her life in the NHS, and certainly at the time was working in hospitals and things. She was contemptuous of all the clapping for workers, so she wouldn't do it even once.
No,
because she thought the whole thing was a farce.
No, absolutely. Didn't get the pots and pans out. We were talking briefly there about the need for consequential politicians. Donald Trump is certainly a consequential politician. And Luke, given you're such an eminent businessman, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the effects of Liberation Day. We're recording on the Thursday, the day after Trump announced this suite of tariffs. The UK, in the relatively, and I stress relatively good position of only having to pay the 10% baseline alongside a higher one on cars. What do you make of this big moment for
I think what people forget is that Donald Trump is a New York property wheeler dealer. And so he has his own negotiating style, if you like, approach to politics. And I think what that means is that he takes an extreme position, mostly, whenever he's trying to force change and do a deal. In political terms, he moves the Overton window dramatically to one side. And inevitably, that changes the whole basis for the negotiation. And ultimately, America remains, for now, the world's largest economy by most measures. And it faces actually quite a lot of tariffs against its products. Some of them, specific financial tariffs, others, non-trade, non-economic tariffs. And he is trying to, reposition things such that America doesn't run such enormous trade deficits, reshoring manufacturing, and, position American industry to compete better in world markets. Now, some of the products they sell and make are never going to be sold abroad, so I don't think he's going to succeed in certain categories, but there are probably others where, there is quite a lot of trade barriers to American exporters. And, he is, so to speak, in a dramatic and possibly clumsy way, positioning America first, which is, I guess, why he was elected. I think this is the early days of these negotiations. Let's see where all the countries line up in a month or 3 months or 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And it could well be very different from where we are today. And hopefully what it ultimately does is more free trade, because mostly that generally makes countries and people richer. I do think, however, there is one big difference more than others in 2025 to what there was, say, 25 years ago. 25 years ago, China represented 6% of manufacturing value added. It now represents 35%. It's estimated by 2030 it will be 45% of all global manufacturing value added. No country in history, certainly modern history, has ever come close to that proportion. And I think what we are waking up to with the advent of AI and things like that is that it's going to be much easier now for China to replicate what they don't do and we do, which is generally services, than for us to now replicate what they do, which is make an awful lot of things. And as they are gradually, for example, in electric cars, getting quicker and better at innovating and designing and producing, and they have the supply chains and the technical expertise and all the other resources you need, infrastructure. Countries like us, for example, which pay, the highest cost for energy of any developed nation, we're not in a good position to be in the defense industry or any other form of heavy manufacturing, transport, electronics, you name it. And without any serious manufacturing base, China is already a bigger manufacturer than the whole of all of the other major next 8 or 10 countries put together. I think that's quite a scary position for the West, unprecedented. And I think some of the thinking behind the Trump administration is a serious correction in that area, because I think ever since 2001, when China entered into the WTO, it has become an increasingly dominant manufacturing workshop for the world. Given the nature of the Chinese regime and the CCP and all the rest of it, I'm not sure, I think China doesn't quite realize how powerful it is, because in any business, what you do is undercut the competition, drive them out of business, and then crank your prices. And we saw just a little bit of that during lockdown, when suddenly there were acute shortages of stuff because it was all coming from China, and China was able to charge big prices. I think there's going to be increasing amounts of that as China becomes ever more dominant in more and more categories. And I think it's pretty scary.
Well, that's one of the reasons why companies have been getting out of China and going to places like Vietnam. And Vietnam has been about the worst hit with these tariffs. Because, I don't share your optimism, I'm afraid, Luke, on this. I do get that Trump drives a hard bargain and often gets a deal at the end of it. And maybe he will succeed with Ukraine, although I'm not that keen on the way he's been going about that either. But with this tariff thing, I think he's a true believer. And he calls these reciprocal tariffs. They're not. If you look at his ridiculous little board, they've literally worked out the so-called tariffs that other countries are imposing on America by looking at what the trade deficit is. He's a balance of payments man. The trade deficits really don't actually matter. America's had a trade deficit with the rest of the world for 50 years, and it's been doing great. He wants to have some sort of equal, as he sees it, equal trading deal with every country in the world. In other words, neither party sells more or less than the other does to them. It's a ridiculous way of looking at this, and I think it's going to be pretty much an unmitigated disaster because tariffs they never work, and there's been pretty much universal condemnation about this across left and right. And on the left, that might be just because they disapprove of everything Donald Trump ever does. I don't know. But tariffs are one of those areas where pretty much every economist agrees, based on ample historical data, they will make you poorer in the short, medium, and long term. They will just make you poor. They are taxes. He has basically imposed a huge tax on the American people in the hope of getting a few manufacturing jobs in America. Now, he probably will succeed in that, but it won't be worth the cost. It never is. And I hope, and I do agree that these are probably not permanent. There will be some kind of climb down, but he's not looking for tariff-free trade deals with people. He wants to reverse the trade deficit. And incidentally, the only reason that the UK has got one of the lowest tariff rate of 10%, it doesn't go.
Well, it's not as low as Canada or as Mexico, actually. But anyway.
Oh, they weren't mentioned in it, were they?
No.
Well, that's interesting. But of course, they got their big threat a month or two ago.
Yes, but it's gone now.
But basically, everyone else gets 10%. The only reason that Britain has got 10% while the EU's got 20% is that we actually have a trade deficit with America. America actually has a surplus with us. It's got nothing to do with the special relationship or Brexit as such.
Or Keir Starmer's charm offensive, which I'm sure was very seductive.
Indeed not. But by the same token, various people have been going out with the kind of cope that, it's not a Brexit benefit. It is a Brexit benefit. We would be paying 20% if we're still in the EU. There's no two ways about it. I saw Lewis Goodall on Newsnight last night.
I'd be surprised he took that position.
He was going on saying, you haven't got your free trade deal with America. Well, no, we haven't, no. But, I mean...
that was always very unlikely to happen.
Yeah. And it may happen if we introduce free speech, apparently, which seems to be Trump's demand. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Well,
free speech for free trade.
But it's a cope.
It's about, isn't it, free speech, you see. We are helping to produce... a trade deal with America.
It would be great if all we have to do is introduce free speech and we get tariff-free trade. That would be a fantastic. I would talk about a win-win. But yeah, no, it's a real cope to say, it's not a Brexit benefit. It is a Brexit benefit. It's in a way an inadvertent one, but it's actually because we are buying more from the Americans than they're buying from us, which you cannot say of the EU.
Absolutely. Luke, I know you're a busy man. We should let you go. So I'm going to forego the postbag this week, but. Very finally, we always have one question that we ask all of our guests because we are a very libertarian, liberal, pro-freedom, anti-ban podcast most of the time. But if you did have to have one ban, what would it be? And the only rule is that it can't be anything too worthy. You can't ban hunger or unhappiness.
You are a dictator.
I would ban all motorbikes completely.
Oh, really?
Because they're noisy and dangerous.
I
think that's
interesting. Well, you know what? It's kind of, in a way, it's kind of surprising that they haven't already, because motorbikes are responsible. Motorcyclists are 25% of all road deaths, but they're only 1% of road traffic. Now, I am not in any way advocating a ban as you are. I do agree that can be annoying with the noise, but it is kind of surprising that the nanny status, the health and safety people have never gone after motorcyclists, because you can always make the argument, well, you can always buy a car. We're not banning high-speed transport, are we?
The only conclusion I come to is they must be a very effective lobby group, because also an awful lot of motorbikes they tamper with the exhaust, and therefore they're over the 80 decibel sound limit.
You're right.
But they're never ever stopped or arrested for it.
So what you're really saying is we should enforce the laws that already exist.
Well,
would that be okay?
That would be sufficient, yes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's not going to happen.
No.
This is modern Britain.
Yes,
we'll just ban something again.
Yes.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Last Orders. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you subscribe and click the bell so that you never miss another spiked video. If you're listening to this on your podcast app, make sure you subscribe there and leave us a glowing 5-star review. And if you'd like to get in touch with your questions or ban suggestions, email us at lastorders@spiked-online.com.